The first ball of the season at Wexford House had gathered 500 candles, and something close to 1,000 people. And every one of them seemed to know, in the particular way a crowded room knows things, that Eleanor Vane did not belong among them. She stood at the edge of the long gallery in a gown, the color of weak tea, its hem let down twice, and the seams at the shoulder pressed flat where the lace had been picked away and sold. Around her the silk moved in waves of rose and gold and midnight blue, and her plain muslin sat in that sea like a gull's feather on dark water. She had come because her aunt had commanded it, and because a woman with £200 a year and a name gone quiet could not afford to refuse the one invitation still extended to her. Near the terrace doors a woman in violet leaned to her companion and spoke behind a painted fan. And the words were not meant to travel, but they traveled. That is the Vane girl. The father drank the estate to nothing before he died. Look at the gown. One almost pities the seamstress who was asked to make it presentable. The companion laughed, a small, bright sound, and the fan lowered. And both women turned their eyes elsewhere as though Eleanor were a draught that had come through a badly fitted window. Eleanor did not flinch. She had learned over the last 3 years that flinching was a language the room could read, and that the room fed on it. She kept her chin level and her gloved hands loose at her sides, though the left glove had a thin place at the seam of the thumb that she was forever aware of, a small, worn window through which the cold of the gallery reached her skin. She had darned it twice, and the third darn had failed, and she had stopped trying, because a woman learns which battles are worth the thread. She looked instead at the far end of the gallery, where a man stood alone against the tall dark glass with his back half to the crowd. He did not dance. He did not drift from group to group in the way the other gentlemen did, collecting introductions like calling cards. He simply stood, tall, and still in a navy coat cut close to the shoulder, one hand resting near the breast of it as though guarding something, and watched the room as though it were a chessboard on which the pieces had begun to move without his consent. A footman passed her with a tray of ratafia and small gilded glasses, and did not offer her one, his eyes going over her head to a cluster of silk beyond, and Eleanor noted the small omission and filed it with all the others. She had become, over 3 years, a careful accountant of such things. The unoffered glass, the introduction that trailed off, the seat left empty on either side of her at supper, as though poverty were a thing one might catch by proximity. She did not resent the footman. He read the room the way the room had trained him to read it, and the room had decided about her long before she arrived. She did not know yet that he had been watching her. She did not know that his stillness had a direction, and that the direction was the far corner where a girl in a tea-colored gown had absorbed an insult without letting it land on her face. You may already sense what the room did not. Stay with her a while, and you will see the whole of it. The man against the glass was Julian Ashcombe, the Marquess of Ravensmere, and he had come into his title 11 months earlier by way of a death he had not been able to prevent. The season knew him as the coldest man in 3 counties. He was said to have refused every hostess in London the courtesy of a second visit, to have danced exactly once since his brother's funeral, and only because a dowager had trapped him against a pillar, to have a face like the north side of a cathedral, handsome and unwarmed. What the season did not know, because he had told no one, was that he carried in his breast pocket a folded letter. He could not bring himself to burn and could not bring himself to answer, and that the letter had been written by the person he had failed. For now he watched Eleanor Vane, and the watching had begun 3 weeks earlier, in a place the ballroom would never have thought to look. Let us go back to that. In the last week of September, Julian had ridden into the village of Marefield on estate business, a matter of a mill lease and a tenant's flooded field, and the rain had caught him at the crossroads and driven him under the awning of a small circulating library that smelled of tallow and old paper. He had stood dripping in the doorway, expecting the proprietor. Instead, a young woman had come from behind the counter with a cloth in her hand, and she had not curtsied and simpered as women did when they learned his rank, because she had not learned it. She had seen a wet man in a good coat, and she had said plainly that he might sit by the fire, until the worst of it passed, and that dripping on the ledgers would not endear him to Mr. Sar. Kobe, who kept the accounts as though they were scripture. He had sat. The fire was small and mean, and he had not minded it, because from the low chair by the hearth he could see the whole of the little room, the crowded shelves, and the ledger open on the counter, and the young woman moving between them with the unhurried competence of someone who has made a place her own. A boy had come in then no more than 8, with rain in his hair, and a book held against his chest like a thing he was ashamed to be returning, and he had stood at the counter turning red and saying, very low, that he had kept it a week past its day, and had not the penny for the fine, and that his mother did not know he had borrowed it at all. Julian had watched the young woman look at the boy, and had seen her decide something in the space of a breath. She had taken the book. She had opened the ledger and drawn her finger down the column and said, in a voice pitched so the boy could keep his dignity, that she found no fine recorded against him, that Mr. Dad Hilby must have marked the book returned already, and that the boy had best run home before the rain worsened. And when the door had shut behind him, she had reached into her own small reticule, and drawn out a penny warm from her hand, and dropped it into the box where the fines were kept, so that the accounts would balance to the farthing and Mr. Prynd. Kobe, who kept them like scripture, would never know a boy had been spared at the cost of a woman who had few pennies to spare. She had not seen Julian see it. That was the thing that undid him. Later, when he turned it over in the long hours, he did not sleep. A kindness performed for an audience is half a performance. A kindness performed in an empty room at one's own quiet cost, believing oneself entirely unobserved, is the only kind that tells the whole truth about a person. He had sat by that mean little fire, and understood that he had just watched something rarer than any jewel the season would put on display that winter, and that the woman who had done it did not know she had been seen, and would have been mortified to learn it. He had asked her name as he left. Miss Vane, she had said, already turning back to her counter and her ledger, and she had thought no more of him. A wet gentleman in a good coat sheltering from the rain, one of 100 faces that passed her counter in a season. She did not know she had been weighed. She did not know she had been found by the one scale in 3 counties that measured true. No, in the Wexford Gallery. She felt the weight of a gaze and could not find its source, and told herself she imagined it, because a woman in a twice-turned gown does not imagine herself watched by the man against the glass. She turned to find her aunt. Her aunt, Mrs. Sagan, Prudence Halliway, was a woman who had married just well enough to spend the rest of her life terrified of marrying no better, and who regarded her niece as a debt, inherited along with the furniture. She found Eleanor by the refreshment table and took her by the wrist with fingers like cool wire. "You are standing where you can be seen," she said low and swift. "Do not stand where you can be seen. It only reminds people. Lady Caro has asked after you, and not kindly. Smile at no one. Refuse nothing that is offered and request nothing that is not." She released the wrist. "And do try not to look as though you are counting the candles to keep from weeping. The season can forgive poverty. It cannot forgive self-pity. It was not cruelty. Exactly, it was fear, wearing the clothes of instruction." Eleanor had learned to tell the difference, which did not make the wire fingers hurt less. She had been, once, a girl with a different future. Her father had been a gentleman of comfortable acres and dangerous optimism, a man who laughed too easily, and loved too loudly, and could not, to save his soul, leave a hopeful thing alone. He had loved her with a carelessness that felt, at the time, like abundance. She could remember him lifting her onto the back of a gray pony when she was 6, and swearing the animal was hers and hers alone, and she could remember the summers of open windows, and a house always full of guests he could not afford to feed and fed anyway. He had promised her a season in silk. He had promised her a pianoforte of her own, and a mare called whatever she liked, and a father who would stand at the door of any ballroom and frighten off any suitor not worthy of her. Then the cards had turned. It was always cards, or a horse, or a mine in Cornwall that a friend of a friend swore would pay, and each loss he chased with a larger hope, and the larger hopes were borrowed, and the borrowing had a bottom. She watched him fall through by degrees over 2 long years, The acres went first, in parcels, the near field, and then the far, the wood where she had played, and then the mill. The optimism curdled into a kind of feverish arithmetic conducted at night by a single candle. Sums that never came right, no matter how he moved the figures. And one gray February morning she had come down to find him in the chair by a grate gone cold, quite still, his reading glasses fallen to the floor, and his hand laid flat over a letter he had written and never sent, a letter to a creditor begging one more month that he had not in the end had the courage to post. The estate had gone to a cousin she had met twice, a careful man who'd changed the locks within the fortnight, and sent her trunk after her to her aunt's house by the carrier marked paid, as though even her leaving must be entered, somewhere in a ledger and balanced. What her father had left her was £200 a year, a name the county remembered chiefly as a cautionary tale told to sons who showed a fondness for the tables and a conviction lodged deep as a splinter under the nail that she was a thing that ruined the people who loved her. He had loved her, and he had ruined himself, and the two facts had grown together in her mind until she could no longer see the seam between them. That was her wound, and she did not speak it, because speaking it aloud would have made it a fact rather than a fear, and she was not yet ready to surrender the difference between the two. The music turned. A country dance formed in the center of the gallery, and Eleanor moved to the wall to let it pass. And it was there, against the cool plaster with the fiddles rising, that she came face to face with the Marquess of Ravensmere for the second time in her life, and the first time knowing what he was. He had crossed the room. She had not seen him cross it. One moment he had been a stillness at the far glass, and the next he stood before her, close enough that she could see the fine dark stitching of his coat, and a small pale scar that ran through the outer edge of his left eyebrow, and his eyes, which were the gray of slate under rain, held hers without any of the sliding evasion the rest of the room practiced when it looked at her at all. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was low and level, a voice that did not perform. "You returned a boy's book without his fine? 3 weeks ago in Muirfield you paid the penny yourself." Eleanor's heart performed a single hard stroke against her ribs, and she felt the heat climb her throat, and she was furious at her own body for its honesty. She had thought herself unseen in that library. To be told, now in this room, by this man, that she had been seen after all, was to have a private thing carried out into the light. "I do not know what you mean, my lord," she said, because deflection was the only armor she owned that still fit. "You do," he said, not unkindly. "You knew Mr. Kobe kept his accounts like scripture. You made the accounts balance, so the boy would keep his name clean, and the old man would keep his peace. I watched you do it from the fire." A pause. The fiddles climbed. "I have thought about it for 3 weeks." She did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing. And the silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had stood inside in years. Across the gallery, the woman in violet had noticed the Marquess of Ravensmere standing close to the Vane girl, and her fan had gone still. Julian did not ask Eleanor to dance. He was not a man who did the expected thing when the honest thing was available. Instead, he asked whether she would walk the length of the gallery with him once, in full view of 500 candles and 1,000 eyes, and Eleanor understood that to refuse would be safe, and to accept would be to change something she could not name. She accepted. They walked. He matched his stride to hers with a care that no one watching could have named as tenderness, and that she felt in her whole body as tenderness nonetheless. He asked her about the library. He asked what she read when Mr. Kobe was not counting. He listened to the answers as though they were being entered into a ledger of his own, and when they reached the terrace doors he stopped and looked at the dark garden and said something that was not a question. "You are cold," he said. It was true. The gown was thin, and the terrace draught came under the doors. Come away from the glass, it was a command. It had the shape of a command and the grammar of a command. And beneath it, running like a warm current under ice, was something that was not a command at all. And Eleanor felt the current and mistrusted her feeling of it, because her wound told her that men like this did not warm toward women like her, and that anything that felt like warmth was a trick of the candlelight she would be a fool to believe. She came away from the glass. That was all. And yet her aunt saw it, and Lady Caro saw it, and the woman in violet saw it, and by the time the carriages were called, the season had a new question to chew. And the question was why the coldest man in 3 counties had walked the length of Wexford House beside a girl in a twice-turned gown. Eleanor lay awake that night in the narrow room under her aunt's eaves, and told herself it was nothing, and did not believe herself, and hated a little that she did not. The Marquess called at her aunt's house 4 days later. Mrs. Preba. Holloway nearly fainted into the umbrella stand. A Marquess did not call in a street like theirs, at a house like theirs, and she flew about the parlor plumping cushions gone flat with age, and hissing at Eleanor to change her cap and receive him, and for the love of heaven to say nothing peculiar. Julian came in out of the cold with rain on the shoulders of his navy coat, and he was too large for this small room, and he did not seem to notice its smallness, which was its own kind of courtesy. He sat where he was bid. He drank the weak tea without a flicker, and he said to Mrs. Holloway, in a voice that admitted no negotiation, that he wished to court Miss Vane, and that he would call again, and that he would be obliged if the household would spare her an hour on Thursday for a drive. When he had gone, Mrs. Pollock. Holloway sat down very suddenly on the horsehair sofa, and looked at her niece as though a plain stone in her palm had begun unaccountably to shine. "Do not ruin this," she whispered. "Whatever you do, Eleanor, do not be yourself in a way that ruins this." Eleanor stood at the window and watched his carriage turn the corner, and felt the splinter of her old conviction press deeper. He would tire of her. He would see on the drive or the one after that there was nothing under the plain gown but a plainer woman, and he would withdraw with the same courtesy he did everything, and she would be left having believed, for a handful of Thursdays, that she was a thing worth choosing. She thought it safer not to believe it in the first place. She was wrong about that, and it would take her a long time to learn how wrong the drives began, and through them the season learned to make a spectacle of her. On the second drive he took her along the river road, and a phaeton passed them going the other way, and in it was Lady Sophronia Ackerby, the diamond of the season, gold-haired and cased in ice blue, who had been raised from the cradle to understand herself as the correct answer to any question a Marquess might ask. Lady Sophronia inclined her head to Julian with a smile of perfect confidence, and let her gaze slide over Eleanor as one steps over a puddle. And to the friend beside her she said, in a voice pitched exactly to Carrie, "The charity case. Taz? How very like Ravensmere to make a project of the season's saddest gown. It will not last the winter." Eleanor heard it. Julian heard it too, and his jaw did the thing she was beginning to learn. A small tightening at the hinge, a stone taking a fraction more weight. He said nothing to Lady Sophronia. At the next turning, though, he said quietly, "To Eleanor, she is wrong," and did not explain what she was wrong about, and drove on. That evening, Eleanor understood the drives were a battlefield, and she, the disputed ground, and she did not want to be ground disputed. She wanted, though she could scarcely permit the wanting, to be a woman a man had crossed a room for, because she had paid a boy's penny in the belief that no one watched. The wanting frightened her more than the mockery. The mockery she had survived for years. The wanting was new, and it could break her in a way the mockery never had. I want to pause here, just for a breath, and say that if you have ever stood in a bright room certain you were the one thing in it not worth looking at, you already understand Eleanor better than the season ever would. Stay with her. The room is about to be wrong out loud. Now let us go on. Because the wound in the Marquess had not yet shown itself, until it did, Eleanor could not understand why a man so plainly capable of warmth had built himself a house of ice to live in. It showed itself on the 4th drive, when the ring came again and he turned the carriage toward Ravensmere itself, rather than back to the town, and brought her into a cold gallery hung with portraits and stopped before one turned to face the wall. He did not turn it back. He stood before its blank canvas backing, with his hands loose at his sides. and for a long moment he said nothing, and then he told her, in short level sentences with no ornament, the thing he had told no one. His brother had been the Marquess before him, and his brother had been the better man, easier and kinder and quicker to laugh, the sort of man who remembered a servant's sick child by name and asked after it. Edmund had been his name. They had been boys together in this house, had raced along this very gallery in stocking feet, with an old nurse scolding behind them, and Edmund had always let Julian win the last stretch and pretended he had not. 11 months ago, Edmund had taken a fever that would not break, and from the fever bed he had written to Julian 3 lines in a hand gone unsteady, asking him to come, only to come, that there were things he wished to say and could not commit to paper. And Julian had been in London. He had been settling a debt of honor for a friend, a matter of a note come due, and a name that would be dishonored if he did not stand behind it. And it had felt at the time like the more urgent thing, because the friend was ruined if he delayed, and Edmund had been ill before and had always mended. He had written back that he would come the following week. When the business was done, he had meant it. There had not been a following week. Edmund had died on a Tuesday, in the gray hour before dawn, with Julian's promise on the bedside table, and Julian himself 100 miles south arguing over a sum of money that he could not now for his life. Remember the amount of... The letter, Edmund's letter, the 3 unsteady lines, was in Julian's breast pocket now and had been for 11 months. He had carried it through the funeral and the reading of the will and the slow, cold business of becoming a Marquess he had never wished to be. He could not burn it, because burning it would be to lose the last of his brother's hand. He could not answer it, because there was no one left to read the answer. And he could not stop carrying it, because to set it down anywhere felt like setting Edmund down, and he had already once set his brother down when his brother had asked to be picked up. I turned the portrait to the wall, he said, because I could not meet his eyes. I have not been able to meet anyone's eyes since, until a woman in a library met mine and did not know who I was, and I found that I could. He looked at her then, and the slate-gray eyes were not cold at all, had never been cold, had only been a door held shut against a grief too large for the room behind it. You paid the penny when no one watched? I have spent 11 months, learning what it costs a man to be watched, and to fail. You did the opposite. I have not been able to stop thinking of it. Eleanor understood, standing in that cold gallery before a portrait turned to the wall, that the coldest man in 3 counties was not cold. He was a man carrying a letter he could not send, exactly as her father had died with his hand over a letter he never sent, and something in her that had been clenched for 3 years loosened by a single degree. She was aware, in that moment, of everything about him at once, in the particular way the body knows a thing the mind has not yet permitted. She was aware of the width of him standing near her in the cold gallery, of the faint scent of rain and horse and clean wool that came off his coat, of the fact that his breathing had gone careful, as though he too were listening to some current run between them. Her own pulse she could feel in her throat, a quick, soft knocking, and she thought, with a flash of the old fear, that if she let herself lean the small distance toward him, she would not be able to unlean it afterward, and that some things, once done, could not be made not to have happened. She reached anyway. Without deciding to, her hand rose and stopped, hovering a breath above the breast of his coat, above the pocket where the paper lived, close enough to feel the warmth of him through the space between, and for one held moment, she did not close the distance, because closing it was a thing she could not take back. Then she laid her gloved hand flat against the coat, over the letter, and neither of them moved. And the rain ran down the tall windows, and the whole of the future turned on the small warm pressure of a hand that asked for nothing. You did not fail him by loving him badly, she said. You failed him by 1 week. Those are not the same wound. I know the difference. I have a father who taught it to me. He turned his hand under hers so that their palms met through 2 layers of glove, and she felt the strength of it close around her fingers, and she felt her own breath catch and hold. He did not speak, because there are moments a level voice cannot survive, and he let the silence hold what he could not say. For a long moment he looked at her mouth and then at her eyes, and something in his face wanted a thing that his restraint would not yet take. And Eleanor saw the wanting and felt the answer of it move through her own body like heat through cold water. And neither of them crossed the last small distance, because both of them understood that once crossed it would remake them, and they were not, either of them, in a hurry to be remade before it could be done properly. "I have wanted," he said at last very low, and stopped, and began again because the words were unpracticed in his mouth. "Since the library, I have wanted to be near you in a way I had no right to name to a stranger. I am telling you now, because I am no longer content to be a stranger." He did not touch her face, though his hand rose halfway to it and stilled. "I do not know how to court a woman gently. I have forgotten, if I ever knew. Yet I would learn it for you, if you would let me be clumsy while I learn." Eleanor, who had spent 3 years certain that no one would ever want her plainly and aloud, heard a Marquess confess a want in a cold gallery, and could not for a moment make her voice work at all. They stood a long while. When at last he took her back to the town, the rain had stopped, and the world was washed and dripping and new, and Eleanor sat beside him with her heart wide open, in a way that terrified her, because an open thing can be wounded, and she had spent 3 years learning to stay closed. Season, meanwhile, had decided. It had decided that the Marquess of Ravensmere was making a fool of himself over a penniless girl, and that someone ought to correct the error before it hardened into scandal, and the someone the season nominated was the Dowager Marchioness of Ravensmere, Julian's aunt by marriage. A woman who had run the family's social affairs for 40 years, and who regarded the arrival of Eleanor the way a general regards a breach in a wall he has spent his life defending. The Dowager was not a wicked woman. She had been raised to believe that rank was a kind of stewardship, and that a great name was a trust held for the dead and the unborn, and that a Marquess who married £200 a year and a ruined father spent capital that was not his to spend. She believed this with her whole formidable heart, and belief of that kind does more careful damage than malice ever manages. She invited them both to a dinner at Ravensmere House, 30 at the table, the diamond of the season seated at Julian's right hand, and Eleanor placed far down among the poor relations, and she chose the evening to end the thing with precision. It came between the fish and the game. The Dowager set down her glass, and turned the whole weight of the table toward the foot of it, with a single question, delivered in a voice of silk over iron. "Tay gin?" "Miss Vane," she said, "I am told your father left debts still unpaid at his death. Tradesmen's debts. A wine merchant was it, and a saddler, and a man in the town who is still owed for the very coffin. I wonder that you can bear the season at all with those men unpaid on your account. Tell me, how does a young woman with £200 a year propose to be a marchioness? Or is the proposing being done for her, by a gentleman too grieved to see clearly?" The table went silent in the particular way. A table goes silent when it has been waiting all evening for a knife to fall. Lady Sophronia's mouth curved. Somewhere below the salt, a fork was set down with a small betraying click. And Eleanor felt the old heat climb her throat, and the old conviction rise up to meet it. The splinter singing its 3-year song. That she ruined the people who loved her. That she was a debt in a plain gown. That the room was right, and had always been right, and she had been a fool to let the candlelight tell her otherwise. This was the dark of it. Not a slammed door, not a torn gown, but a question asked so precisely that it laid her whole life open on the white cloth for 30 people to examine, and named her, in front of the man she had begun to love, as a thing that would cost him. She could have wept. The season would have understood weeping and despised it. She could have fled. The season would have called it proof. Instead, Eleanor set her own glass down and looked the length of that shining table at the Dowager Marchioness, and answered the question she had actually been asked, which was not about money. "The coffin is paid," she said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "I paid it myself, over 18 months, in shillings, from £200 a year, because a man who is owed for a coffin should not have to grieve his own kindness. The wine merchant is paid. The saddler has 12 shillings outstanding, and will have them at the quarter, and I have his note to say he is content to wait, because I told him the truth about when I could pay, and he found the truth easier to trust than a promise. I have paid every debt my father left my lady, slowly, and alone, and without complaint, because that is what is done by people who were loved by someone who err. I do not know how a woman with 200 pounds a year proposes to be a marchioness. I know only how she proposes to be honest at a table that would prefer her ashamed. If that is not enough for your house, I will rise now and spare you the game course." She began to rise, and the Marquess of Ravensmere rose faster. He stood at the head of his own table in his own house, before his own aunt, and the diamond of the season, and 30 of the most quietly vicious mouths in the county, and he did the thing the season had sworn he was too cold to do. He crossed the length of the table. He did not hurry, and he did not raise his voice. He came to stand behind Eleanor's chair, and he put out his hand, and he said, into a silence so complete the candles seemed to hold their breath, 7 words that traveled to every corner of the room. "She is my betrothed." "Sit down, Eleanor." He had used her name, not Miss Vane, her name in front of all of them, claiming her with it, and the using of it was louder than any speech could have been. The dowager's hand closed on the stem of her glass. For one moment, one only, the mask of 40 years slipped, and what showed underneath was not malice but the particular fear of a person who has just watched the order she gave her life to defend prove itself smaller than she believed. She had thought she was protecting the name. She saw, in the space of Julian's 7 words, that she had been protecting only her own certainty, and that her nephew had found something her categories could not measure, and had chosen it in front of her rather than behind her back, which was the one thing she could not forgive, and the one thing she could not undo. Lady Sophronia, at Julian's emptied right hand, understood before anyone that she had lost, and understood, too, that she had never quite been in the running, that she had been a piece of furniture arranged to make a point, and she did the one graceful thing left to her, which was to lift her chin and say nothing, and let the ice-blue gown carry her through the remainder of the evening, as though nothing had cracked. Below the salt, an elderly cousin no one had introduced said quite clearly, "Good," and returned to her fish. Eleanor sat. Her hand found Julian's on the back of the chair and gripped it, and she did not care who saw. The game course came in. The table, having watched its verdict overturned by the very authority it had assembled to confirm it, adjusted itself with the boneless speed of all such rooms, and by the sweet course, half of them had persuaded themselves they had liked the vain girl all along. The dowager did not stay for the sweet. She rose and inclined her head to Julian with the stiffness of a woman conceding a field she had thought impregnable, and said only, "You will bring her to me on Sunday. If she is to have the name, she should have it from the family, and not from the town." It was surrender, dressed as instruction, and Eleanor, who had learned from her aunt exactly what fear sounded like when it wore the clothes of command, heard the surrender inside it, and was gentle enough not to smile. They were married in the last week of December, quietly, in the small church at Ravensmere, with snow coming down soft and steady past the tall windows and settling on the stone so that the whole world outside went white and hushed. There was no crush of 500 candles. There was Julian and Eleanor in a gown of warm cream that fit her at last, and the elderly cousin who had said "good," and Mr. Ram. Kobe the librarian, who had closed his accounts for the day, and come the whole way in a hired gig to see a girl he had thought no one watched be watched by everyone who mattered. The dowager came too, in gray, and stood at the front, and when it was done she took Eleanor's hands in her cold, formidable ones, and held them a moment longer than duty required, and said, "Lo, so only Eleanor heard. I was wrong about the gown." It was as near an apology as 40 years of certainty could manage, and Eleanor took it as the whole of one, because mercy costs less than pride and lasts longer. That evening, when the guests had gone, and the snow had thickened, Julian took Eleanor into the cold gallery where the portrait still hung with its face to the wall. He stood before it a long moment. Then he reached up and turned it, and let his brother's painted eyes meet his own, for the first time in 11 months. He took the folded letter from his breast pocket. The letter he had carried so long the creases had gone soft as cloth, and he did not burn it, and he did not answer it. He set it on the table beneath the portrait open where he could see it, and he let it be what it was, which was proof that he had been loved by someone. He had failed by a single week, and that the two things could live in the same heart without one destroying the other. Because a woman in a library had taught him the difference between a wound and a fault. "He would have liked you," Julian said. His voice was not level now. He had stopped needing it to be. "Then I am sorry I did not know him," Eleanor said, and put her hand over the breast pocket that was empty at last, and felt his heart beating steady under her palm where the paper used to be. Outside the tall windows, the snow came down over Ravensmere and buried the gravel drive and the bare black trees and the whole shining, cruel machinery of the season, under a mercy that asked nothing and forgave everything. In the small church that morning, a girl in a twice-turned gown had been named, before the whole county as a thing worth choosing, and the naming had held, and would go on holding through that winter and the springs after it, in a house where the portraits faced outward again, and the letters got answered, and no one ever again was left to pay a coffin alone. On the hall table by the door, where anyone entering out of the snow would see it first, stood a small penny box from a circulating library in Muirfield, brought by Mr. Kobe as his wedding gift. Its slot worn smooth. Eleanor kept it there all her life. She never told the county why. She did not need to. She knew. And one gray-eyed man knew, and between the two of them, the knowing was enough. If Eleanor's winter warmed something in you, stay a moment before you go, and think of the one small kindness you did once when you were certain no one was watching. Someone was. Someone always is. Thank you for staying to the end of her story.